Hi, everybody. My name is Stephanie Bolin, and we can advance to the next slide. I am currently a park ranger at Kartchner Caverns State Park, located near Tucson, Arizona. And I just wanted to give you a quick version of how I got to this point and how that birding kind of was part of that. So we can move to the next slide. I graduated high school super early, and because I had no idea what I wanted to be when I grew up, I majored in English at a university called IUPUI. It's a combination university of IU and Purdue, located in Indianapolis, Indiana. And while there, I got a working scholarship working for a library, and I fell in love with that. I loved connecting with and helping people, working the front desk, being part of our maker space, just everything that had to do with that, and just really being present in the community. And next slide. So I decided to become a librarian. And I actually enrolled in the Masters of Library and Information Science program at IUPUI, which I completed a few years ago. I got a job working essentially as a librarian at the main branch of the Indianapolis Public Library System. And through that time, I came to realize that being a librarian was less working with people and actually included a lot more behind the scenes work of things that wasn't really engaging for me, wasn't really challenging for me. And I just really wanted to work with people more than anything. And about halfway through that program, something in my personal life changed. And advance the slide, I found birds. I became a birder. Which, if you don't know, is basically just someone who goes out looking for birds and trying to see as many species as possible. This here is a white-eared hummingbird that I saw in 2021. It's a rarity that came up from Mexico into the Tucson, Southeast Arizona area. And next slide. The more time that I spent outdoors, the more that I realized that, I didn't want to be a librarian after all, the kind that was behind the scenes. I learned that I could still connect with people and be present in the community, but I could do that through environmental interpretation. And so I started switching my life and my focus to how I could make my career out of birds and out of my rekindled love for the outdoors. And so next slide. So eventually, I ended up at the Eagle Creek Park Ornithology Center, working as a naturalist there. Primarily, my work involved leading programs, leading bird hikes, working the front desk, and showing people around the nature center, and training and caring for our currently, at that point, 7 birds of prey who were our avian ambassadors. That center now has 9 birds. I also got to put together, and you can just flick through these next slides as they go, but presentations, classes, so these are a couple examples, flyers and displays for around the building, but also online as well, especially during the pandemic, and also virtual programming and videos as well. And next slide. Earlier this year, I moved to Tucson, Arizona. My family has been out here for several years, but I finally made the leap, and I took a job as a park ranger at Kartchner Caverns State Park in Southeast Arizona here, which is where I work now. A large part of my job currently consists of leading tours through our cavern system. But if you advance to the next slide, I have also started incorporating my love for birds and birding and nature and the outdoors into my role as well, which includes leading bird hikes and creating programs and virtual presentations about birds and birding. And next slide. And as my personal interests expand, I've also been expanding my knowledge and program options to include bats, plants, reptiles, and mammals. And next slide. But no matter where my personal curiosities take me, I will always go back to birding. Birds are just everywhere, especially here in Southeast Arizona. They're just absolutely all around, but even in Indiana, they're everywhere. And being able to work them into my career, finding ways to connect that together has really made my life really fulfilling. And I hope that you got a little bit of value out of that. Thank you for allowing me to share that.
Thank you, Stephanie, so much for sharing. We're going to go and share from James Cranton, who is Sarah President, and also Ken Weaver, Sarah's Vice President as well.
Thank you. Just want to, so with that introduction, I probably want to roll right into it because as I found out in preparing this presentation, there's a lot to discuss in a fairly little time, but I'm happy to talk more in breakout rooms about what Sarah is doing with rocketry in Southern Arizona. Okay, so for starters, I'll introduce model rocketry. The key thing is, and you're going to see a bunch of pictures of my oldest son, who's now 17. He was 12 in most of these pictures. Model rocketry, many of us may have flown them as kids, but model rockets are made of cardboard, paper, plastic. They're lightweight kits designed to be flown over and over again and recovered safely. Typically, they're going to be less than 3 pounds, but the kind of things you flew as kids were probably more like less than 3 ounces. So there is a wide range of rocketry options out there in a market that's really evolved a lot in the last 20 years. We rate our motors in terms of total impulse or the amount of power in them, how much energy they're putting into the sky, and we designate them by drive letter, or by drive letter. That's a computer. We designate them by letters. Specifically, A through G are typical motors that you would fly as a grade schooler or high schooler. And power doubles with every letter of the alphabet. So that A motor is half the power of a B motor, and a C motor winds up at 4 times the power of that A motor. And that A through C range is typically where young kids are flying rockets. Typically, you're going to want to fly a rocket in a field around the size of a soccer field or two. Bigger is better in this case, and it's always, it's tempting to try to push the limits and fly as high as you can in a field you may not fully have scoped out, but that's really tricky because the key to kids enjoying rocketry is making sure they recover safely and are able to fly again. It's a real bummer if the very first thing that happens is you watch your rocket disappear into the sky and it's never seen again. That's not the experience we're going for. So in addition to the experience of the kids or the adults, safety is really a key issue, and the Model Rocketry Safety Code that's managed by a couple different national organizations, but the main one that's commonly in use today is the National Association of Rocketry, also Tripoli Rocketry Association are the 2 big guys in the United States. And those safety codes that they manage are based on federal regulations, but they're also common sense guides to how to fly safely and have fun with it at the same time. So some of the key takeaways from those, if you were to summarize 2 key points, is get permission to fly first, and knowing when not to fly is really critical. If it's too windy, or you go to the public park and you have a soccer game going on one of the fields right next door, and your rockets might drift there, you just got to recognize that that's part of the hobby, is knowing when you take responsibility for safety and don't fly that day. Next slide. Now, there's a bigger end of this sport too, and that is designed for adults, although there are some opportunities for 14 and older to also certify to fly high power rockets. But technically, according to BATF rules, only adults can handle the high power motors. So there's always another adult flyer of record for these 14-year-olds who have high power certified. So, this is the range where you start getting into H through O motors. Those are the typical motors flown in these high power rockets. Again, doubling power every letter. So you're talking a lot more power, even at the base level of an H motor. And, as you see in this picture, my son flying my level 1 certification rocket, they can be big. It's a 4-inch diameter, roughly 3.5 foot long rocket that weighs about 8 pounds. So you really, you're increasing risk by putting that much more weight and energy into the sky, because what goes up is going to come down. And so it really is a wake-up call when you crash your first high power rocket. You really realize very suddenly that I overlooked some things there that I really need to pay attention to next time. And when you realize, how much energy comes out of one of these things in a crash, it really opens your eyes to what's going on. So typically these high power rockets are going to be flown in a much larger field, half mile to a mile across. which is hard to come by, but can be done. And FAA approval is usually required for most high power rockets, certainly the bigger ones. And rocketry clubs like Southern Arizona Rocketry Association provide a lot of support and mentoring in terms of the logistics and expertise to really do this safely. One of the things that you talk about when you're looking at these bigger rockets is that they can start flying some interesting payloads. You can have GoPro cameras on board, other sophisticated electronics. A lot of times you have barometric sensors on board, altimeters, that are either recording altitude during the flight or even monitoring altitude to recognize when the rocket's coming over the top to deploy a parachute. So that's a lot that's really evolved in the last couple of years and made this a lot more accessible at the hobby level. There's even GPS trackers on board that can help you find your rocket when it's recovering a mile away. So next slide. Kind of at the total opposite end of this, and here you see my son at a competition in Missouri several years ago, is competition rocketry. And here the contest flying that's done varies widely in terms of what events are done, but it is event-based. It might be a duration event. The rocket in my son's right hand there is a parachute duration model. He actually won the nationals with that this year, back in 2017. And the idea there is you put it up on a certain size motor. In this case, it was a C motor, and see how long you can keep that rocket in the air. But he wasn't actually the longest flights that day. The longest flights that day never came back. And the trick is you actually, you're doing this on 3 flights and you have to recover 2 of them. So it's not always a brute force approach. A lot of times it's getting your rocket into the right thermal or avoiding the big thermals that are going to blow your rocket right away and you don't get it back. Other things might be altitude competitions, coming to either the highest altitude or a very precision altitude, coming as close as you can to a certain altitude. A lot of what goes on in a national competition called TARC, or the American Rocketry Challenge, is fragile payload. So that is egg lofting. So you're simulating an astronaut in flight, trying to recover eggs, intact, raw eggs, no doubt, to simulate an astronaut's experience. And so there's local, national, and international contests, in fact. And one of the really interesting parts of this contest rocketry arena is that flyers may spend weeks or months perfecting a $10 model that weighs just a couple grams or ounces. It really is extremely meticulous work sometimes, but it can be really interesting to see. Next slide. All right, so one of the big areas that Sarah provides community service in Southern Arizona is through community launches. A lot of times these are attended by scout groups, but we have around 90 members in our club. And we are there to provide services for our club members and the community at large. So we're providing leadership expertise in terms of inspecting rockets before flight, making sure they're safe and ready to fly and appropriate to fly under the current conditions. We're controlling range safety. So we're making sure that spectators are in the correct area. One of the key issues is as long as you get your parachute or other recovery device out of that rocket at the peak of flight, things are going to be pretty much all right. But the thing we really worry about is rockets that go up, don't deploy their recovery device and come back down just as fast as they went up. And to do that, we want to make sure that all that is happening out in front of the crowd, that is out in a recovery area, and the crowd is back away from that recovery area, so there's not a risk of people being hurt or property being damaged. We do a lot of the logistical support, finding places to fly, getting landowner permission, and dealing with the regulatory compliance of national safety codes and FAA waivers, and fire codes, all those kind of things. We also provide launch equipment and instructing and mentoring. In the meantime, the community's out there learning how to fly safely. That's our biggest goal, is make sure people understand how to fly safely, have fun, and really learn about all the wide range of things you can do, because it is rocket science, which is kind of cool that you can actually learn that really at the simplest stages. Next slide. One of the other big areas that we focus on, at least in past years, has been school build and fly programs. And that's obviously been under a lot of strain this year with the COVID pandemic, but we have done some limited builds, but really kind of the bigger groups where we've been out there with 100 students there, those have not been happening, and we are we're trying to balance that delicate mix of, we have volunteers, many of whom are older, going into schools. We don't want to be a vector in a pandemic, and we don't want to subject our members or volunteers to any health risks. So it's been difficult, but typically in a rocket build, we're going to build and fly between 10 and 100 students. They're going to build a rocket maybe on one day, and then the next day they'll come back and fly it. Or maybe you do it over 1 week and another week. Really depends on the school's environment. But the goal is that each student gets to build and fly their own rocket. And, with some small number of them, they're going to say, hey, this is the coolest thing ever. This is how I got started, actually, 40 years ago. So it can be something that really ignites curiosity to see that you can do this. And then you wonder, well, what's next? What else can I do? Because during that build, you've got to end during the launch, you have a lot of time to talk about, all sorts of things like Newton's laws of motion, equal and opposite reactions, how propulsion can work, how stability works. We want to encourage kids to be creative about how they design their rockets, but we want to make sure that they do them safely. And so understanding rocket stability is a key part of that. Understanding how to construct rockets, right? Some kids have not worked a lot with glue. And so, teaching kids how to use the right amount of glue and how to apply glue successfully and with as little frustration as possible. During the early parts of the pandemic, I taught a rocketry class remotely. And, I spent an extra 20 minutes after class one day teaching a second grader how to tie knots over Zoom. That was interesting, but we got there, and that was really rewarding. And really ultimately safety, because when, as you see in this picture here, kids and spectators are again in one area and the rockets are coming up toward the camera. So if bad things happen, they're happening in a safe recovery area. But it's teaching about safety and thinking about what kids are doing. All right, next slide. And finally, we have a website. We have a fairly large web presence. We manage our events through this website software. And one thing you've heard me talk about twice is about getting permission to fly, and that's perhaps one of our most common questions we get from people in the community, and that is, where can I fly rockets? That's a tricky question to answer, and we kind of answer it in an indirect way. The ultimate thing is get permission first, and oftentimes one of the easiest ways to get permission is to go talk to a school principal. If you're flying little rockets, school principal can probably give you the okay to go fly in that school field after school or on a weekend. Just always being mindful that there's other users of those fields. But a lot of cities are going to prohibit model rocketry, either because they just don't have the range, the space in parks to permit it, or because of a lack of knowledge about the safety of the hobby. And so we often deal with, we work with a lot of cities and other jurisdictions to try to open up spaces for people to fly. So that's a lot of our focus, kind of advocacy for the hobby in Southern Arizona. And really, one of the interesting things, kind of as an aside, one of the biggest challenges we've been facing in recent years, here in Arizona, in Southern Arizona especially, we got hit really hard with a lot of rain, which was awesome. But our range is usually just scrub brush and a little bit of grass here and there, but the grass just overran the place. And we were out of launches for a good 4 months. So that is, it's been a challenge. We've spent a lot of time mowing the fields with tractor equipment and, out there with stirrup hose, just trying to get the range safe again for flight. And it continues to present a problem, but it's part of the joy of being an organizer in a club. So that's all. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, James. I am so excited to share this presentation with our educator network because, again, like you mentioned, those students are going to be the ones leading the charge and asking, let's do this and let's make it happen. So I'm so excited that you mentioned that. So we are going to go to John Philreese, and he is going to share a little bit more about woodworking. John.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Let me see if I can get my video on here. There we go. Yeah, I'm John Philreese. I've got 42 years in the engineering industry and medical, military, and space businesses. And one theme throughout my whole career is I've always done woodworking as a hobby. And many of the engineers I've worked with over the years have. It's a great hobby for engineers. It gives you an outlet for your inner artist, as well as honing a lot of your technical skills. You can see from these pictures, woodworking range, it runs the gamut of things that are very technical, very structured, to building your own tools, to building things that are very artsy. Next slide. So these pictures are just some of the craft kind of things I've done. But you know, the advantages, you know, it's not just STEM, it's STEAM. It gives you a chance while you're working every day, you're doing projects that could be fun, they could be forced on you to do what the company needs to get done, and you don't necessarily have the choice. Here you can go off and do something that's creative, do something you want to do either for yourself or other people. Many engineers, you know, feel like Leonardo da Vinci. We think we're artists. We've got that spirit where we want to create and do things that not just are functional and efficient, but also look good and make other people happy. So it's a great hobby for that. Like I said, I've been doing it for most of my career, and it gives you an opportunity to do almost anything. You can work with just the wood. You can work with wood and glass, with metals, with virtually anything that goes into it. Next page. When you do a project, whatever you pick, you really, to do it right, have to follow a lot of the engineering principles that we do in running any engineering project. You've got to understand your requirements. What are you trying to accomplish? What do you want what you produce to do? What will it have to live through as far as its environment? What will it have to work with for the other materials that it has to mate with? How will it look? How will people touch it and feel it? So there's many aspects to understanding the requirements. Then you got to translate those requirements into how you're going to design it, how you're going to build it, what materials are you going to use, how are you going to put it together, whether you're going to use hand tools, whether you're going to use power tools, all the different methods that are possible to do this. Then you've got to do all the things again you'll do in a project. Make a parts list, make design drawings. So it's very technical. You got to do the math, in some cases, very complex math. And I'll show you some pieces on the next slide that are very challenging. Then you've got to go procure it. Sorry, lost it there. Can you go back a slide? Okay, thanks. You've got to go procure everything. You've got to, again, pick all your methods and processes. And it gives you a chance to learn different things and do different methods and processes and work with different materials each time. So you're learning the whole time you're doing this. Over the 40 plus years I've been doing woodworking, I've very rarely done the same thing more than once or twice. Every chance, every time I do something, it's a chance to learn something new, try something different, create something that I haven't done before, and to learn from others. There's lots of resources out there and lots of pictures of other people's work, and lots of magazines and trade journals to read as well. And again, anything you do here, there's lots of different ways to do it, whether it's hand tools, power tools. You can use routers or saws to do many of the same things. You just learn what's comfortable for you. Next slide. So, the range of things you can do is just amazing. I tend to like to do a lot of the craft projects. I showed you a few photos because they're quick or quicker often. They're in many cases I can use hand tools. It gets me more in touch with the wood, more quiet, relaxing environment. Doing cabinetry. Typically, you're going to be on a bandsaw or a table saw and bigger tools. And you can see here, you need drawings, you need designs. You can see even something as simple as the joinery in the top picture could be very complex to design that, get the dimensions right so everything fits, and then actually cutting that so it's precise and there's no gaps and it fits together tightly, and it's going to hold up to the changes in wood through humidity and temperature is very challenging. Even the lower right table, that looks very simple, is challenging to have a surface that's that flat, is stable. The dimensions are pleasing. You can go back to things like the Pythagorean theorem and all the way the Greeks looked at what's pleasing for dimensions and ratios. You can look at the bowl in the middle and imagine how challenging that would be, looking at a blank piece of paper to figure out how am I going to cut the individual pieces of different types of wood, glue them together into a block, and then put that on a lathe and cut it so you get a pattern like that. So there's a lot of challenging that. And, the joinery at the bottom is one of the many complex joints you could do that's beautiful to look at and very functional. And the table at the left is an example of a very complex mechanism where that table will close by coming together as it rotates in one direction, and it'll be the size as if all those wedges come together. And then if you rotate it in the other direction, it expands out and the pieces underneath come up and fill the gaps, and it becomes twice the size of the table. So anything you want to do, you can come up with, you can try, like I say, anything that you can imagine, there's an opportunity to try something new and interesting and fun in woodworking. And then when you're done, you've got something that you can use or give to other people, and it's very, very satisfying. So it's a great hobby for technically minded people. That's it.
Thank you so much, John. That was amazing to see that woodworking and just the intricacy of the details that you really have to look at. And it essentially connects with rocketry and bird watching, the intricacy and the details that come with those STEM hobbies. So thank you so much to our presenters today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. But if you have any questions you would like to ask our presenters today, please put them in the chat and we'll get those answered. But to get us started off, I would love to, I think John touched on this a little bit, but I would love to ask, why is it important to maintain your STEM hobby throughout your career? I don't know if Stephanie or James, if you want to take this on first.
I can speak to that because I think it actually is very characteristic of the model rocketry industry or the hobby. I started this when I was 10 or 12 years old, and you approach things very differently then than you might later in life. When I was back at my parents in college doing some summer work, had some spare time and a little disposable income, I picked it up again at maybe 19 or 20. But then, I didn't touch it again until my own son was 4. And, he stumbled across a box of old rockets at my mother's house. And he's like, well, I want to fly those, right? So you have these cycles, and it's a very common pattern, right? You get to middle age, or the kids are starting to head out of the house, or your kids are young and they get excited into the hobby. You wind up having this cyclical pattern where you come back to it a couple different times in your life. And so that's something we see a lot, and it's great to see, but each time you learn things differently, right? When you're a kid, you just want to get stuff up in the air and it's great fun, and you crash stuff and that's almost better. But then you gain a little experience and you're like, well, that wasn't such a great idea, was it? And you realize that you can actually work to become more successful at not landing a rocket in a tree or achieving a specific, set goal, like flying to a certain altitude or, recovering that egg intact. Or maybe you just want to refine your hobby skills to ways that you never could do when you were, a teenager. But now, now you're 20 or 30 and you can actually really do some high quality, exquisite paint jobs on some of your rockets. And that can be a lot of fun. So yeah, I see that it's a pattern that people come back to, but as I look at it now in my 50s, I'm able to have a lot more perspective than I did at a younger age, and really, that's kind of what's led me to do more of the leadership aspect of things, to become involved, to make sure that this hobby is accessible in Southern Arizona, or wherever you live. There's clubs all over the country. There's several hundred clubs across the country, and there's quite a number around the world. The Eastern Europeans tend to be very outstanding at a lot of the competition sports. So it's really pretty interesting to have exposure to those kind of environments too. And that of course requires some resources to actually do international travel that aren't always accessible. But it's one of those things that you can do at different ages.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing, James. Stephanie, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think for me, it's a lot about just balancing things. You know, our work can be very stressful sometimes, and no matter what your career choice is and what you're doing, you know, as long as you have something that is driving you, that's giving you passion, that's, you know, something that you can look forward to, it gets you through kind of some of more of the drudgery of maybe other parts of your career, and things. And so I think that's, for me, why it's really important, why there was, I just ended it, but I had maintained submitting a checklist of all of the birds that I see in a day for over 1,000 days. I hit 1,000 days. I let it go on for a couple of extra months, and then I decided to just end it. But it was just that little bit every single day just reminded me of what I moved out here for, what I took this job for, and, you know, it just, I don't know, it just keeps it up. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
technically 1,053 days.
Wow, that's amazing, Stephanie. Thank you for sharing that. I know we had another question in the chat here. When deciding on your career pathways, what advice would you give to students? I know we had talked about, you know, that STEM career pathway versus the STEM hobby, and then it kind of molding together at the end. John, I don't know if you want to share a little bit about that, and what advice would you give to students in deciding their career pathways?
Well, engineering's one of those things I think you're almost born into. It's, you know, you've got to find what makes you happy, what gets you excited, and what makes you want to get up in the morning and go do what it is. You know, with the woodworking hobby, the nice thing is, you know, like Stephanie was saying, even when you've got, you know, some drudgery in your job during the day, you've got something to come home to that you know, you can make what you want it to be, whether that's a big complex project like making furniture or doing crafts, or just carving a piece of wood and seeing what comes out. From a career standpoint, you know, the advantage of having something like this is you learn about yourself as you go through your career, and very few people start out a career in something that they stay in for 40 plus years. Even in my career in engineering, the whole time I've been in multiple different industries that are very, very different. Working in you know, consumer versus military or space, there's a core set of engineering principles and disciplines that are the same, but each industry is very different. You have to learn different things, and you're satisfying different problems. So having this, you know, a hobby that complements what you're doing, you learn more about what you like, and you also learn things that you can take to that industry. I've learned plenty of things doing woodworking that are much simpler or cheaper ways of doing something that in a company they might spend a fortune doing, or make it very long and complicated. And so, you know, it's very simple, and this is how I do it in my garage. So you know, whatever you're doing, you know, do what gets you excited now, and you know, it'll evolve over time.
Awesome. I love that you said that. This is the cheaper way that I do it in my garage. Absolutely. That's perfect. Stephanie or James, do you have any advice that you would give students?
I think on my end, all I want to say is that careers are not linear. It's a little bit about what John was saying. You know, you can enter into a career path. Don't be afraid of change. Don't be afraid to go into one thing and then decide that you want to do something else, and, you know, feel like, oh, but I've already put, you know, 7 years into this. Is it really okay to change and move on to something else? And yes, it is. Careers are not linear. What advice I would give is to, as you're in those, you know, stages of your life, take what you can, you know, learn what you can from each of those, each of the jobs that you have, the careers that you're in, because there are elements that overlap between different careers. And, a lot of people ask me, can I draw similarities from my time in the library world to my times at Park Ranger? And the answer is yes. So there are definitely things that overlap. So don't feel like anything you do is a waste of time. There's always something that you can learn from, even if your career shifts later on.
Yeah, and I mean, I can second what Stephanie said in terms of, the nonlinear nature of careers. If you look, when I was young, I was born in the late 60s, and, we're going to the moon then, right? But NASA was going to the moon, and that was about it. But, you look around today, and there's half a dozen companies in Arizona that are sending rockets into space. And that's such a huge change, and there's an enormous aerospace industry, and it doesn't just have to do with rockets, but aircraft and all sorts of different technologies. But not only has the landscape changed in terms of the market, but the number of careers that are involved in these STEM related fields is enormous. Even if you don't think you are a techie person, there's somebody that needs to create the cover art for model rocket kits, or somebody that needs to design the chairs to go into spacecraft. There's all sorts of stuff, a wide range of STEAM skills, as John had referenced, that go into this stuff. So if you don't think you can cut it as an engineer because you've got bad math grades or something, well, if you're a great artist, or maybe you're just a people person and you're the one up there. I mean, it's so fascinating and exciting to watch these SpaceX launches where they've got somebody that can they know what they're talking about, and they can give the layperson a really good understanding of what's going on during these launches. Those are people skills. And so they may have nothing at all to do with STEM.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for all of your guys' time today. Thank you to the presenters for answering those questions. Amazing, just amazing information from all three of you. So thank you so much. So we are actually going to be moving into a couple of breakout rooms to dive a little bit deeper with our presenters and ask them a little bit more of our questions. Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie, for adding that. So I will go ahead and open up our breakout rooms. I will stop our live streaming and recording, and you will be in the breakout rooms with your moderators and a presenter to dive a little bit deeper and ask a few more questions. There we are. Perfect. Well, awesome, everyone. Welcome back. We hope that you had a dynamic and valuable discussion with your group today, and we're able to share many resources, ideas, and just simply thoughts with each other. So thank you guys for coming back into our main room. And I would love to ask our moderators to kind of share one major takeaway that you had from your breakout room. So we'll start with breakout room 1.
Yeah, so we had some really interesting conversations about, if thinking about how to get programs like the rocketry program started in schools, kind of where do you, or started working with students, where do you begin? And we got some really great advice about just kind of choose something and get going with it, get started. You can learn as you go, choose something that you are passionate about or that you find interesting, because that passion will kind of flow through to your students, and it'll help you kind of keep going and learning more so you can share with them, as well as, don't be afraid to ask for help and bring in volunteers who might have more experience with you or a different experience than you, so that they can share their wisdom as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Claire. Casey.
Yeah, so I think two sort of really interesting things that came from the conversation. One was, talking about, hobbies into careers or careers into hobbies. And Matthew said, it's more of like a feedback loop for him. It's like he's learning things that he's excited about, and then he's able to share that with his students. And it's sort of this continual cycle. And I feel like that's also, like Stephanie said, rather than a linear career pathway, I think that's really how a lot of us end up moving through life in different careers and different hobbies, is sort of, you learn things and then integrate them moving forward. And the other thing that we talked about is sort of changing how we talk about the STEM careers that STEM hobbies could feed into. So a couple of the things that we talked about was, rather than talking about potentially like SpaceX, and like James was saying, rather than if you want to work with rockets, being like, well, you have to be an engineer and you have to read these 5 things, identifying a field like rocketry and then finding all the different access points, like being being the PR person or being, the HR manager for the like astronauts or whatever it is. So really, giving people that opportunity to find different access points that aren't necessarily the most obvious. And then also something that was really interesting was something that Fritz brought up about how, science is sort of pursued, or STEM really broadly is really portrayed as sort of this individualistic pursuit of like a few select geniuses. And so really going back to the issue of representation and just, talking about how STEM is not just 5 geniuses that have made the fields of science and mathematics, but that it's this collective pursuit of everybody who's ever engaged in science, and making that I think making that more obvious to students gives them a way to visualize themselves going into one of those entry points.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing from your breakout rooms. And at this point, we simply want to thank you all for attending our STEM Community Lunchtime Conversation session. Your participation and your input are what make our STEM community stronger. So we will be following up in the next few days with an email summary of our discussion from our breakout rooms, copies of our presentations, a link to our video, and a registration link for our upcoming conversations. So we would love to formally invite everyone to our upcoming conversation all about sustainability in action in Arizona. So coming up on Thursday, February 3rd at noon. And we would love to thank everyone. Thank you to our presenters that joined us today and shared all of your amazing STEM hobbies with everyone. And have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.